Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I'm your host, Doug Stuart, and I'm joined today by Alex Bernardo, who is also host of one of the Christians for Liberty Network podcasts, the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. He's host of that. He has the honor of living in the same district in Kentucky as Thomas Massey, which makes him the envy of the entire LCI team, because he's probably the only team member it's worth voting for, right?
Yeah.
And who can vote. And you know, you're here today. I have you on today, Alex, to talk about a podcast series you've been doing on a new book that's kind of sitting over your shoulder. And you corrected me off air that I had the name wrong, and I was like, I don't know what this is. Like, is this like the new quest for the next Jesus? What's this book called, and what are we talking about?
Yes, this one is the next quest for the historical Jesus. If you talk about the new quest, people think of Ernst Käsemann and Günter Bornkamm. It's like basically a time in Jesus research between the 50s and the 70s. So that the new quest is now very old.
The 50s and the 70s, which century?
So of the 20th century, yes, the 1950s through 1970s. Very good clarification.
As somebody who's into history, you probably need to keep that straight when you tell people about different centuries.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's been a while since you've been on to talk about you and your podcast and some of the aims that you have for the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. You were just like running gangbusters over there with just cranking out episodes weekly, and then you have a bonus, like you're throwing in your Sunday sermons because you were part of a preaching team for your church recently. So just give us a recap of your bio. How did you get into, who are you? What do you do? And how did you get interested in theological studies?
Yeah, so my name is Alex Bernardo. I am a public school teacher, which I know is a real sticking point for a lot of libertarians. But in my defense, when I decided to become a public school teacher, I was like a classical liberal, not a full-blown anarchist. So I have an excuse there, at least for that period of my entire life. But I became a Christian when I was in high school, and I just started reading the Bible over and over again. And when I say the Bible, I mean the New Testament. I didn't really touch the Old Testament much until I went to college. But I fell in love with the New Testament, and I would read through it from start to finish, from Matthew to Revelation, and start over again. And I think between my sophomore year and my senior year of high school, I think I had to have read through the entire thing like 20 times. And so when I went to college, I wound up wanting to get a degree in biblical studies because I really wrestled with, like, there were so many aspects of the Bible that I just struggled with. Like, I didn't understand, and it didn't make a lot of sense to me. And there was always a gap between like my own personal practice and what I saw other Christians practicing around me. And I just had a really hard time reconciling that. And so I went to college and worked on my degree in biblical studies. I started to realize that interpreting the Bible within its historical context made sense of a lot of the issues that I had been wrestling with for, at that point, 8 or 9 years. And I just fell in love with biblical studies. I fell in love with it as a discipline, and of the way that it shaped my life and the way that it impacted how I lived out my faith. And after I graduated college, I was a bivocational minister for several years, did student ministries, and found that the part of that job that I liked the most was the teaching aspect of that, which is ultimately I wind up becoming a teacher. So long story short, I've become a teacher, and I don't have really an opportunity to explore these really big ideas in biblical studies anymore. And it had been a couple of years since I'd stepped down from ministry. And so when I started really diving into libertarian philosophy, I realized that there was an overlap between the topics that I was interested in biblical studies and libertarian economics and political philosophy. And so I started the podcast to try to bridge the gap between the two. And 2.5 years later, almost 3 years later, here we are.
Yeah, here we are. Do your students ever ask you to repeat yourself because you talk too fast? I'm still catching up.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm with you.
Yeah. My students are usually not paying attention, so I very rarely get asked to slow down.
Well, they're not paying to be there, so
that's exactly right. Yeah,
that might be part of it for sure. So, biblical studies, in contrast to things like systematic theology and so forth, those are kind of areas that you and I have talked about with our team and together, and just bantered about, different ideas there. Where do you see biblical studies or biblical theology as it relates to something like a systematic theology? Like, what role do each of them play in sort of Christian discipleship?
Yeah, so there have been times in my life that I've had a very negative posture towards systematic theology, although my views on that are starting to change a little bit. I think that with biblical studies is simply the study of the Bible as a historical phenomenon. So trying to locate the Bible within its historical context, understanding each of the documents that are contained within it as a product of a particular place and a particular time, and trying to wrestle with how these work historically, whereas systematic theology is a systematic understanding of God and then kind of all of the consequences of that belief. So systematic theology is more of a branch of philosophy. I think that there is a relationship between the two, but I think that for a Protestant who believes that the Bible should be our ultimate source of authority, you have to start with the Bible first and then develop your systematic theologies based on historical reading of the Bible. Yeah. And I think that when you do that, you can have a very fruitful systematic theology, but you can't do anything productive within systematics unless it's anchored in how the texts were originally designed to work when they were written 2,000 plus years ago.
Would you say that systematic theology in many ways, at least in the Protestant West, has predated the surge of historical biblical theology?
Yeah, I would say that that's absolutely true. Now, you can go back to the patristic period when there was more of a natural connection to the time period in which these documents were being produced. And you see this very robust systematic theology in the early church fathers, but they also realized that these documents were anchored to a particular historical context. And so a great example of this is the debate between like Arius and Athanasius at the Council of Nicaea, where Athanasius realizes that the arguments that they were having were moving beyond what the texts were designed to say. And that wasn't necessarily a problem. He just understood that you had to at least have an anchor in history. And I think throughout the Middle Ages, the church really drifted away from that. And it wasn't really until the modern era with the original quest for the historical Jesus that we began bringing back those historical elements into the text. And a lot of that was these Enlightenment rationalists that were trying to undermine the authority of the Bible by saying if we situate it in historical context, it delegitimizes the claims that are being made in there. And then Christians coming back and saying, actually, if we look at it through a historical lens, there's a lot in here that makes sense. And I think that that's really where a lot of that tension comes from. And I'm obviously one of those Christians that believes that when we study the Bible in its historical context, it actually makes a lot more sense for us today. And it gives us a much stronger foundation for our theology and practice, even if it sometimes challenges our most cherished theological ideas.
Yeah. I heard Tim Keller once describe the relationship between biblical theology and systematic theology by using an analogy of saying, you can read the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and then you can also have with it an encyclopedia of all the different things that are about the Middle Earth, like an encyclopedia of Middle Earth. And both are very, if you really want to learn it and study it and understand it, both are very, very helpful. So if you want to know, what are elves like? What are hobbits like? And so forth. Well, you could read the whole series, or you could go to Encyclopedia and look at the entry for hobbits and kind of get the gist based on the book of that. And so both are very helpful and useful, but there's no substitute for actually the narrative itself. Which is not to say that that's the equivalent of biblical theology, because biblical theology is still doing theology, but it's taking it from a different vantage point as opposed to sort of thematic or topical.
Right. And everyone does theology. Even secular biblical scholars are doing theology in the sense that we have to draw conclusions from these texts. And ultimately, if you come to the conclusion that these texts aren't inspired and that these texts don't have any special significance, that is a theological conclusion that you're drawing from the text. And of course, as Christians, and especially as Protestant Christians, we believe that this is kind of the ultimate authority. So the way that we interpret the text is ultimately going to affect the way that we understand God and the nature of reality in our practice. And so you can't divorce the two. And in reality, a good and healthy theology will be derived from a deep study of the biblical text.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you said that, because there's a lot of theological commitments, or sort of what's the word I'm looking for here? A set of theological I don't want to commit by a lot of these scholars in the sense of like, hey, we're just going to assume that we don't know if God exists. Like, we're just not going to take that for granted. And that's fine on the one hand. I mean, you can certainly do that. But on the other, it makes a lot of Christians a little bit leery of reading books like The Next Quest, because it's like, well, these are people who don't share a lot of the same priors that I feel are important to my biblical discipleship and just understanding of the scriptures, understanding of Jesus and who he was. And so, I'm listening to some of the episodes that you're having with these interviews you're having with some of the authors, the contributors, and I'm just like, well, this is great for me, but like I don't know if that's important for me to know. For example, some of them were just like, oh man, I can't come up with an example, but I'm sure you can illustrate this with the people who are sort of basically not assuming whether or not Jesus really was raised or was really God or whatever. Like those are theological belief. The theological belief that Jesus is God is not something that you can just sort of see through evidence, I guess. I mean, in a sort of scientific way. And so these people are going to assume it that way. They're going to come at it from that approach. So what is it about the historical quest? I guess the original. What do you call it? The old quest?
Well,
you said the original.
Yeah. So traditionally, the quest for the historical Jesus have been divided up into 3 phases. And I think everyone kind of understands that they're arbitrary, but this is the way that scholars have talked about it. And so you have the first quest, which was essentially the late 18th century through the 19th century. You have the new quest, which was conducted in the 1950s, basically the 1970s. And then you have the third quest, which was the late 1970s, early 1980s through the late 90s, early 2000s. And those have been the 3 previous phases of the quest for the historical Jesus. And essentially, those 3 phases represent different methods that scholars have used to try to reconstruct the historical Jesus. So there's a distinction in general among the methods that scholars will use in their historical reconstructions.
Okay, so the question then is, what is it about this historical approach or these approaches, that appeals to you as somebody who actually do hold strongly theological convictions that many of those people don't share? And or more cynically, why isn't the Gospels just enough for you, Alex? Why can't you just read the Gospels? And why can't you trust the Bible? No, go ahead. Tell me what your interest is.
It's not that I can't trust the Bible. It's that I can't trust myself, because I am a limited, intellectually fallible human being. We all have limited knowledges, and we're all born into particular social and cultural and historical contexts that in large part determine the way that we think about the world that is around us. So there's no such thing as an unmediated interpretation of the Bible. Anytime you pick up the Bible and start reading it, you're bringing a world of assumptions with you to the text. And if you're not careful about the method that you use to read the Bible, then you're always going to just impose your own worldview and your own ideas on the text. And then what happens is, instead of the Bible being a source of authority, the Bible just winds up being a projection of all of your own subjective preferences. And so it winds up being that the Bible is really just your personal authority mediated through Scripture, which is not what we want as Protestants. And so, given the fact that I don't understand everything, I think that trying to understand the Bible as a historical phenomenon, that these are attesting events that actually happened in history, that is the foundation of my faith, that there's actually something here beyond just my own imagination. And when it comes to a figure that is as significant as Jesus, and I think that it doesn't matter who you are, I think there's almost universal agreement that Jesus is without a doubt the most significant figure that has ever lived. Well, there are millions of people throughout history that have tried to approach and interpret Jesus, and they've done so in different ways. And so we have to try to develop a set of tools that we can use to understand Jesus as a figure in history. And unless we have those kind of tools that guide the conversation, then we're always going to be stuck in this position where everyone's interpretation of the Bible is just purely a matter of their subjective preferences. We don't actually get anywhere, and we don't derive any understanding from it. And I think that even when I interview scholars on these issues that don't share my theological worldview, I do believe that the methods that they're trying to utilize to reconstruct the historical Jesus are methods that are incredibly important and that give us access to information about Jesus as he would have been understood in history that can shape our faith in an extremely positive way. And since the quest for the historical Jesus have really all been about the methods that we use to analyze him as a historical figure, this newer phase in historical Jesus research that has been dubbed the next quest is kind of the next evolution of that. And I feel that there are a lot of methodological aspects of this that are actually very beneficial to Christian faith. Now, for people that would balk at the idea that, we should have all of these methods to interpret the Bible, why is it not good enough just to open it up? Well, the writers of the Bible themselves, like the writers of the New Testament, are deliberately interpreting the Old Testament. So there's no such thing as a lack of interpretation. And we have 4 Gospels in the New Testament, and I don't believe that those 4 Gospels give us divergent pictures of Jesus, but they don't all give us the same picture of Jesus. And so you have Mark's interpretation of Jesus, you have Matthew's interpretation of Jesus, you have Luke's and John's interpretation of Jesus, and they're all a little bit different. And so the idea that we have to interpret Jesus and try to explain him within our own context goes back to the Gospels themselves. So it's a very biblical thing to do, to try to understand Jesus and then translate him into our context. And I think that that's what these methods from a Christian standpoint are designed to help us do. How do we understand the significance of Jesus? How do we understand what he really taught, as opposed to, just whatever theological tradition we happen to be brought up in? And how can we take that knowledge and then apply it to the church in the modern world?
So let's talk a little bit about what it means to say the historical Jesus, as opposed to what other kind of Jesus.
Yeah. So the historical Jesus is just the Jesus that we can reconstruct using historical methods. So in the older phases of the quest, there was this kind of hard distinction between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith, meaning that the Christ that was worshiped by the church had to have been different than Jesus, the man, as he was in history. And again, considering that modern biblical scholarship is rooted in kind of Enlightenment skepticism towards the establishment churches in Europe, the original idea was that by using these historical methods, we could undercut the power of the church. If we got behind the Gospels to Jesus as he was in history, then we could prove that a lot of the theological claims that the church made about Jesus were not true, and thereby undermine the political authority of the church in late medieval, early modern Europe. That was the idea. But it turns out that for Christians, a lot of these historical methods reveal that there are certain aspects of Jesus as he was in history that are completely compatible and congenial with our faith as Christians. And so when we talk about the historical Jesus, what we're talking about is specifically the Jesus that we can reconstruct as a historical figure. What can we say about the man as he actually lived in first century Palestine, walking, talking, ministering? Like what was he actually like historically? And again, there are a lot of scholars, including scholars that contribute to the next quest, that would say that that figure is radically different than the Jesus that Christians worship. I would say that using those methods, that the Jesus that we can reconstruct from history is actually very compatible with the Jesus. That I would say that there's no difference between them. And so, but that's what we mean by the historical Jesus. It's the Jesus that we can reconstruct using historical methods.
Okay, so do you have an example of one of the ways in which the historical Jesus turned up to look different, at least according to some people, from the Christ of faith?
Yeah, well, I would say that one of the elements about Jesus as a historical figure that's different than the way that Christians have often understood him, and I think that this is something that is incredibly rooted in the synoptic tradition, in particular in the Gospels themselves, is that Jesus is a Jewish prophet who is announcing the reign of God. So this is like kind of central and fundamental to Jesus's whole message and ministry, and a lot of what Jesus does and says is rooted in the Old Testament prophets, and that Jesus was deliberately emulating people like Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And not only was he doing that as a historical figure, but the gospel writers understood that and they incorporated that into their historical presentations of Jesus himself. Now, that picture of Jesus as a Jewish eschatological prophet is a lot different than kind of the more theologically oriented presentations of Jesus that have been offered throughout Christian history. And often, really, a lot of this is just, a lot of the ways in which the Gospels have been read throughout Christian history is as a springboard for Orthodox theology. So you have the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople in the 4th centuries that determined that Jesus was fully man and fully God, and that he was pre-existent. And the Gospels have often been read by Christians as if that's the only thing that's significant about Jesus, that he was fully human and fully God, and that he came to die for our sins. But Jesus, when we analyze him as a historical figure, it's not that that's not true. It's just that he's doing a lot more than that. And Jesus as a prophet is one very good example of ways in which many historians have looked at Jesus through a historical matrix and said, this probably best fits what he was trying to do in his ministry. And that has profound consequences for the way that we see him and the mission that he gives to the church.
So a person who is doing this historical quest is going to say, well, if we look at him as a prophet, we can set aside, we don't have to deny it or embrace whether or not he's God, but we can set it aside as we inspect what type of prophet he was. And what was he saying in his actions as an eschatological prophet in the line of Ezekiel, as you said?
Yeah, without having to make any commitments about Christology or anything like that. And
so that's why you think it's compatible, is because one isn't saying, well, just because I'm saying he's a prophet doesn't mean I also don't believe he's God.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
And I think those two things can be held together. And there are a lot of times in which, we see language like Son of Man and Son of God in the Gospels. And generally, the way that has been read is through the filter of Nicaea, where people say, well, when Jesus says that he's the Son of Man, that means that he's human. And when he says that he's the son of, or when the gospel writers say that he's the Son of God, it means that he's divine. But when you anchor those terms within the language of Second Temple Judaism, the way that these terms would have been used in the first century, you see that the term Son of Man goes back to Daniel chapter 7, and it's a way of referring to Jesus's messianic identity. And the term Son of God goes back to passages in the Old Testament like Psalm 2, which also refer to the coming Davidic king. So these are titles that denote Jesus's kind of messianic status. They denote the fact that Jesus is this long promised king. And again, this doesn't take away from the fact that Jesus is divine. It's just not that when those titles are used for Jesus in the first century, historically speaking, they mean something more than that. Not less than that, but more than that as well.
Yeah.
And so when the church only focuses on Jesus's divine and human status, then we can also miss, and this is very important for libertarians, we can also miss the point that the gospel writers are trying to make, I think, all throughout, that Jesus is king. And that's an absolutely essential component of all the gospels that sometimes the divine Christology dynamic has caused Western Christians in particular to screen out.
Okay, I get it. So it reminds me of the one thing I think N.T. Wright, I think he was saying this sort of positively about the quest for the historical Jesus, was that it kind of countered the idea that, I think his phrase is that people believe that Jesus floated around first century Palestine, 3 inches above reality, being God all over the place. That was his phrase. And it's just, when you hear him say it in his British accent, it just sounds really funny, really clever. But yeah, so that seems to make sense of it as well. What do you think some myths are that people have about the quest for the historical Jesus that, like critics or people who aren't critics but listen to the critics, or people who are being said, don't investigate that? What are misconceptions or myths that they might have?
Well, I mean, I think that some of the misconceptions and myths that they would have is that this is really a product of explicitly liberal Christianity, that there are kind of certain theological and political biases that are built into the quest. And I do feel like for a lot of, especially very conservative to fundamentalist American evangelicals, they would look at the quest of the historical Jesus as a threat to traditional Christian orthodoxy. So it's kind of like that conversation that we were just having. Well, if some scholar comes along and says that Son of God doesn't mean that Jesus is fully God, then that undermines Orthodox Christian theology. And so they would balk at it from that perspective. And so I really do feel like that's kind of the biggest misconception that a lot of Christians have about the quest for the historical Jesus, is that it will automatically rule out certain Orthodox theological positions. Now, I do think, and this is one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to the quest for the historical Jesus and for historical Jesus research in general, I do think that it has to reshape the way that we understand Jesus. Like for me, the kind of caricature that I had of him as a figure when I was in high school did not match the text that I was reading in the New Testament. And that was one of the things that I really wrestled with. But we had all of these, I would go to church every single Sunday and I would hear the same message about Jesus is fully God, he's fully human. You hear the same exact things. He came to die, and like his number one mission was to come and die for your sins. But then you read the Gospels and you're like, man, it seems like there's more to it than just that.
They don't talk about this very much at all.
Right. Yeah. Right. And again, it's not that it's not there, because as a Christian, it definitely is. It's just that there are other issues that are equally as important. And I think that and I understand the concern among very conservative Christians. Like, we want to be able to uphold our Orthodox theology. That makes complete and perfect sense. When you start reading the Bible in its historical context, it scrambles a lot of the categories that we're used to thinking about Jesus in. And I think that there are a lot of Christians that believe that will necessarily result in people having to abandon their faith. Yeah. And I don't see that as being the case at all. But that does seem to be, in my experience, the number one concern. If you push too hard on the history, then eventually the theology will unravel. And I don't necessarily think that has to be the case, but I understand why people are worried about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel like pastors who might be against this quest, or just either not interested in it, or maybe even actively against it, in order to protect their flock, so to speak. And I realize that this is kind of a patronizing way to approach things, but they might want to not confuse people, right? Like, so
Yeah.
if son of God or son of man doesn't mean what we often thought it mean through our Nicene, way of looking at the text, if that is what led us to believe something is true, and the historical quest leads us to say, well, that's not what that really means, you and I would say, well, okay, that doesn't mean that the theology you believed is bunk. It just means that there's other reasons for which to hold on to that theology. But I can understand that you don't want to disempower and cause confusion to lay people who aren't gonna want to aren't gonna be they're not gonna know what to do with this, right? Like, especially since it gets pretty dense sometimes. I mean, I'm listening to some of these interviews that you're having, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, like I'm not even interested in this, and I wanted to listen to this episode.
Right.
Like there's just these like small portions, and I was like, this is, and I'm like, I don't know what this means for my life, and it just adds confusion. And so why not just stick with the sort of inherited theology? Is there a benefit to that at all, or do you feel like if you were advising a pastor to sort of be a little bit more authentic, what would you say to say, hey, you know what, this isn't as much of a threat as you might think?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first part of your question first about why this is important and practical to our lives. The reason why we call historical Jesus research the quest goes back to a scholar named Albert Schweitzer, and he's one of the most important Jesus researchers, I think, of all time. And at the end of the 20th, or at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, he published a book called From Reimarus to Vrede, which was translated into English as The Quest for the Historical Jesus. And this was, I think, published in English in like 1905 or 1906. And essentially what it was is that he looked at all of the Jesus research that had been done in the 19th century, and he came to the conclusion that all of these 19th century reconstructions of the historical Jesus were just a reflection of the preferences of the author. And so he goes through like case after case where he sets these scholars that are producing these giant lives of Jesus in their own historical context and says, if you look at like this person's social location and their political values, you can clearly see how their interpretation of Jesus was shaded by their own personal experience. And so he has this really brilliant line towards the end of his book where he says that if you want to know the true heart of a man, all you have to do is read what he's written about Jesus. And the point that he comes to is that like every single person has done essentially nothing but come up with a Jesus that reflects their own interest, right?
Which is such a meta thing to say about the project that he ended up catapulting, right? Like, yeah, that's still true, right? It's almost like what the Keynes quote about a defunct economist. It's like, yeah, dude, you're the defunct economist. Anyway.
Yes. Well, and this is exactly what, and so like 30 years after that, another great scholar named Henry Cadbury wrote what I think is the best book on this issue. It's called The Peril of Modernizing Jesus. And in that book, he says the same thing. He's like, there are all kinds of gaps in our knowledge about Jesus. And there are many different ways that people from various traditions have interpreted Jesus. And what we tend to do is we tend to fill those gaps in our knowledge about Jesus. And we tend to fill the space between our different interpretations about Jesus with modern content. So we have this problem in the modern world where we're always trying to make Jesus out to be this modern figure. And by doing so, we're remaking him in our own image. And Cadbury was very critical of kind of like the liberal interpretation of Jesus that had become very popular in the early 20th century. And the reason why it's so important to try to anchor our beliefs about Jesus to who he was as an actual figure in history is to make sure that we don't wind up falling into the same trap of remaking Jesus into our own image, which I think, even with the next quest, some of the contributions in that book, I think, clearly do that. There are clear examples of where some of the scholars that are writing are modernizing by trying to fit Jesus into their own category. But we do have to have a set of historical methods for analyzing him that will allow us to step back and try our hardest not to make him into just a reflection of ourselves. And so from a ministerial standpoint, given that Jesus is the center of our faith, we should do everything that we can to try to make sure that we're approaching him with humility and honesty instead of just imposing our own values onto him and saying, oh, well, look, Jesus clearly supports every single one of my social and political perspectives. Therefore, I'm right and you're wrong because Jesus is on my side, which is often the way that that's been used.
That's only true for you and me, Alex, and LCI. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
I think there's two articles. There's two articles on libertarianchristians.com. One's written by you, one's written by me. It basically says Jesus was not a libertarian.
Yes, absolutely.
And so we actually still don't even believe it that way, for sure.
Yeah. And I forgot what the second part of your question was. I'm sorry about that.
How would you advise a pastor? Like, okay, so that what you just said, and I'll get to my second part of there. What you just said was actually like, to me, I'm just like, well, that seems fine. This is a whole this was born out of your quest, to use that word, to understand Jesus in his original context and understand the scriptures as they were written and as best we can. So it's just more data and more evidence and more investigation into who was this Jesus that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and of course Paul writes a little bit about. And so that all sounds great. Like, I already know enough about the quest for the historical Jesus to understand the controversy. But when you put it that way, it doesn't sound very controversial. So I guess in some sense, you almost answered the second question, which was, what would you advise a pastor to understand about the historical quest, whether the next quest or the original historical quest, when it comes to getting interested in it, for that matter? Or if they know, like, I can understand that they might have college-age kids or, graduate students in their church, and these people are being taught these things, and the pastor's a little nervous. What would you tell them to be like, no, you don't need to be nervous about this?
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's like we were saying before, I can understand some of the hesitation that pastors might have, because there are, like, for someone who's brand new to Christianity, well, someone who's brand new to Christianity wouldn't be able to understand really much of what was going on in that book. But I can understand a very intelligent lay person reading some of the chapters that are presented in that book and having serious questions about how it impacts their faith. That's absolutely certain. But I do think that pastors need to educate themselves about what's going on in the world of academic biblical scholarship, because whether they like it or not, in 5 or 10 years, the ideas that are in this book are going to trickle down into seminaries. And so the next generation of pastors are going to be exposed to some of these ideas. When you send your kid to your favorite Christian college, these are the kind of ideas that are going to be bouncing around in those universities. And so we need to understand, and even if we don't agree with all of the methods that are being employed by historical Jesus researchers, and again, there are many chapters in this book that are very clearly influenced by critical theory. And I just completely reject that as a method for analyzing the historical Jesus. But we have to understand how scholars are coming to those conclusions, how they're using those resources, if we want to be able to mount an intelligent critique of them. And so you can look at a volume like this, and the next quest is not even like one thing. There are a lot of different scholars from a lot of different backgrounds. You have evangelicals, you have atheists and agnostics, you have Jews, people from all over the spectrum that are contributing to an article like this. We have to be able to understand how these methods work so that we can explain it to our congregations when those questions arise. And you are going to have, like, educated people, or maybe not even educated, maybe just people that read the Bible and are interested in learning more. You're going to have those people in your congregations that are going to ask questions about how people outside of the church are reading the Bible, and you should be able to have good answers to those questions, or at least point them to resources that they can use to help them answer those questions. This is going to come up. And I'll just say, like, anecdotally, in my own experience, both in youth ministry, and I'm on, like, the preaching team at my church, and every now and then I'll teach these classes at my church, and we'll get into some of these issues, and, like, the lay people find it really interesting. Like, I go to a very conservative church, but people are interested in these conversations. Like, they find it fascinating. And there's some of them that are like, there's definitely a potential to challenge my faith in ways that I might not like very much, but they genuinely want to understand how, we come to these conclusions. And then also how someone like me can read literature like this and still be a fairly traditional Christian.
Yeah. How much of this is just you're interested in it, and so you like to learn about it, and as opposed to you need to learn about this for your walk for Christ?
I would say that it's probably 80-20. I would say that 80% of my enthusiasm is completely personal, and a lot of the episodes that I've been releasing lately are like pure vanity projects. I mean, some of these are scholars that I've admired for a really long time, and it's just amazing to have the opportunity to sit down and have a conversation with these people whose works I've been reading for 15, 20 years now. So that's great. But again, if we believe as Christians that Jesus is the center of our faith, and we really should believe that as Christians, and that the Gospels are the best sources that we have to give us information about who he is, then we should try to want to read the Gospels in an intelligent way. And we should try to want to understand exactly what the evangelists are trying to communicate to us, because I do think that ultimately, if our allegiance is to Jesus and to Jesus alone, and allegiance is a very loaded word for the two of us, but if our allegiance
another
is
episode,
to Jesus,
we'll get into that.
Yeah, if our allegiance is to Jesus and Jesus alone, then we should actually know or try to understand who it is we're giving our allegiance to. And this is like the real problem with the way that Protestants have read the Gospels since the Reformation, is that for Protestants, and this is just, it's going to be controversial, I guess, to some people, but it's just true. For Protestants, we've always privileged Paul over the Gospels. And so oftentimes what happens is we construct these very complex systematic theologies based on our reading of the Pauline letters, and then we use Paul as the lens through which we use the Gospels. So Jesus is not a figure to be studied in his own right. The Gospels are just sounding boards for theologies that we've derived from Paul. And one of the things that has really attracted me to historical Jesus research is that it allows us not to sever the connection between the two, because I don't think that you can, but it allows us to say, well, what if we put some of these questions that Paul is dealing with in his letters to the side and just look at the kind of questions that the evangelists are trying to answer, and also realizing that the evangelists are maybe trying to give us they're trying to give us information that's different than the information that Paul is trying. Now, again, this isn't a matter of like discontinuity. It's not a matter of them being in conflict with one another. It's just a matter of differences, right? And so I think that if we can set some of those burning Pauline theological questions to the side and learn to address Jesus in the Gospels in their own right, then that can only deepen our faith and maybe sharpen and clarify and refine some of the questions that we have about Pauline theology.
Okay, I'm going to amend what you said there, and I would say that Protestants generally often struggle to keep Paul to keep Jesus as important as Paul. I think the Churches of Christ, especially, and the Anabaptists especially, would probably pipe up and say, "Hang on, Alex, we've been privileging Jesus too." But all that said, for those wanting to get in, I think one of the things that I've appreciated about the faith that I inherited is that when I began to explore some of these things, and I didn't dive in like you have with the historical quest stuff, it wasn't of interest to me when I was going through seminary and kind of changing my theology and adopting it as my own as an adult. But one thing that kept me safe in a way, or at least I felt safe knowing that whatever it was that I learned and understood about what was being said in the scriptures, I always believed and continue to believe that the scriptures are infallible, meaning that that God will not fail to accomplish what God wants to accomplish through the written scriptures and how the Holy Spirit works in them, whatever that is, however we want to define that. That's the truth, and that if I want to explore the historical Jesus, or if I want to explore process theology, or I want to explore these other things, I can still come back to things. When I say these things, I mean things that like are either really fringe or definitely out of bounds, okay? According to a lot of people, that I could still come back to, well, yeah, but I believe the Bible is infallible and that God is going to do what God needs to with that, or what God wants to with the scriptures. And so I felt safe. So a question here related is to our conversation. Can somebody stick to holding to infallibility and also engage in the historical quest, maybe even adopting a lot of its views and saying, oh yeah, okay, that's a good point. Yeah, throughout, and not feel like that part is threatened? Because I feel like, and the other component to this is, as I was reading, I didn't really read scholarship or even just popular theology that threatened the idea of the infallibility of scriptures. We could talk about the inerrancy piece. You and I are not inerrantists, and so that wasn't a component of me feeling like threatened. I was able to ratchet past that, but with respect to infallibility, let's stick with that. Can you read the historical quest and come out still being an infallibilist?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And again, if by infallibility you mean that the Bible is generally reliable in what it records and that it is authoritative for the church, then yeah, I think that it's absolutely completely compatible with that idea. And again, one of the great examples
just a question: the historical quest people don't necessarily agree with that statement, right?
Oh yeah, no, there'd be plenty of people that wouldn't agree with it, or there'd be plenty of people
that who do.
Yeah, and again, like even with this next quest book, there are scholars from all over the spectrum. The episode that I have coming out tomorrow is with Rafael Rodriguez, and he's more of an evangelical. Like he's someone who I think would be firmly within our camp and share a lot of our presuppositions, and he still contribute to that So yes, I think that that's absolutely correct. A really good example of this, though, is that for like the inerrantist, and this is where, and there are a lot of different constructions of biblical inerrancy, and some of them are a little bit more comprehensive in historical scope than others. And so I don't want to peg everyone that holds to that doctrine to the same board, because it's just not true. Like there are many different interpretations of inerrancy, and that's fine. But one of the greatest examples of this phenomenon, and here's why I think that the authority reliability thing, this is where this really comes in, is that there are discrepancies between the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are clearly drawing from the same well of sources about Jesus, and yet they tell all of these stories in slightly different ways. And there are times where if you put a story in Mark against a story in Luke, you cannot reconcile them completely historically because there are too many divergences to make sense. So you can go two options with that. If you're a hardcore, everything that the Bible says has to be historically true, your only two options are either that, well, the Bible is wrong, or you have to find some sort of way of harmonizing them, which does a radical injustice to the text.
Yeah, like Jesus cleared the temple twice or something.
Right. And a great methodological example of this, in a way in which like these historical ways of pursuing Jesus are actually helpful for addressing these questions, is that I did an interview with her, one of my favorites for the Next Quest interview series that I've been doing, who has a contributor in the book. Her name is Helen Bond, and she's a really great scholar, very nice person. And she writes an entire chapter in the book on the Gospels as a form of biography. And there's been a growing amount of historical Jesus research literature and Gospels literature, which have tried to understand the Gospels as a form of Greek biography. And she breaks down how Greek biography was designed to function. And essentially, Greek biography is designed to do two things. It's designed to recount the life of a great man, and it's designed to paint a picture of that great man so that other people can emulate him. And so to that extent, biographers selectively rearrange material. They have no problem kind of constructing these grand speeches that are legitimately rooted in the perspective of the subject, even if they weren't spoken verbatim by the subject. Within the realm of Greek biography, that wasn't off limits. And so if you understand the Gospels as trying to accomplish the two goals that all Greek biographies accomplish, and also understand that they are giving us presentations of Jesus that were consistent with the historiographical standards of ancient Greek biography. It's not that they're making things up whole cloth, but they're willing to creatively utilize their sources in order to give an overall presentation of Jesus.
They're doing something trustworthy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so all of those so-called contradictions between the Gospels just disappear. And it's not that they're not you still have to deal with it, but it makes a lot more sense to say, okay, if we understand these as biographies, then if there's a story in Mark and a story in Luke and the details aren't the same, it doesn't create a historical problem for Orthodox Christians. You know?
Right. It's not like these people were like, hang on, we can't say it this way because in 2,000 years, Alex Bernardo is gonna be confused.
Right. Yes, that's exactly right. Well, and then even taking up Mark is, and we don't know the audience behind the Gospels. We can infer from the material that they include and the way that they redact the material that came before them, who they were trying to write to. But we know that Mark has a different audience than Luke. And so, of course, Mark is going to tell his story about Jesus in a way that is different, that is based on the needs of his audience. And Luke, who's writing to a different group of people, is going to selectively rearrange and edit his material to meet the needs of his audience. And so all of this is completely within limits in first century biography writing. And while that doesn't necessarily conform to the modern standards of historiographical accuracy, if we understand the biographical nature of the Gospels as a historical reality, then it reshapes a lot of these modern questions that we might have. And it actually winds up putting us in a position as traditional Christians to say, well, the Gospels, given the fact that they're not designed to be 100% historiographically accurate, and that there is a lot of innovation and creativity in play in the way that the Gospel writers utilize their sources, that solves a lot of problems for us. And we can be confident that, again, these Gospels give us an accurate presentation of Jesus.
All right. How many episodes will you have done? I mean, by the time this releases, from the time we're recording this, Alex, is going to be a couple weeks, but how many are you going to be doing once this is all said and done?
So there were, I think, 32 chapters in the Next Quest book. And as I was reading through it, I realized that this is kind of like a monumental work of biblical scholarship. And I really do think that this is something that's going to have a major impact on the field. So I went through and I selected, I think, maybe the 12 articles that I found the most compelling. And then I whittled it down to about 10. And so I think that I've released 5 so far. I have one coming out tomorrow, and then I have 3 more in the works. So I think all said and done, it's going to be 8 or 9 episodes on the next quest, all dealing with slightly different issues.
Okay. So last question I have for you, and then, actually, no, I have 2 questions.
Okay.
Next one is, this is we've clearly talked about the appeal that it has for you as a Christian, as a believer, as a Protestant. And your show is called the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. And I know that slightly different from the way that this show is, which was we try to integrate that as much as possible. You sometimes just do something that's Protestant and then you do something that's libertarian. Is there any part of the libertarian in you that sees value in understanding the historical Jesus?
Oh, absolutely. And again,
other than we know Jesus overthrew the money changers, and that's historical fact.
Right. Yeah. Yes. This is one of the really subtle things that I try to do with my show. When I have an episode where I interview a biblical scholar on an issue that on the face seems to only be about biblical scholarship, there is, in my mind, a relationship to the political consequences of my reading of the Bible. And this is really, like, for me, one of the paths that took me to libertarianism was doing historical Jesus research and trying to understand Paul and his historical context and coming to the conclusion that the gospel writers and Paul and all of the other writers of the New Testament were really, really serious about the kingship of Jesus. That's a non-negotiable, fundamental aspect of New Testament Christology. You can say what you want about Jesus being God and Jesus being human and all of those kind of things, but we absolutely cannot take away from the ubiquitous, monolithic reality in the New Testament that Jesus is king over the entire world, and all of his earliest followers perceived him as such. And I think that when you are utilizing these historical methods, all of the roads ultimately lead back to the idea that Jesus was an eschatological prophet announcing the kingdom of God, and that his earliest followers understood that he was that king. And I think that it's almost impossible. Now, you can deny that. Like, you can say, okay, well, this is just a thing. Maybe Jesus did think that he was the Messiah. Maybe he didn't, and his followers attributed that to him, and maybe he was wrong. But all of the sources that are included in the Bible point in that direction. And when we utilize these historical methods, I think it becomes more and more obvious to see that the messianic reign of God through his anointed son is central to the witness of the New Testament. I mean, Joshua Jipp, another New Testament scholar, had a book that came out a couple of years ago called The Messianic Christology of the New Testament, where he argues that Jesus' messianic identity is the central theme of all New Testament theology. And I think that he makes a lot of excellent points in that book. And so by utilizing these methods as a Christian, given our confessional nature, that can get us back to these traditions of belief in Jesus's messiahship. And I think that ultimately, if we are going to translate the political consequences of that belief in Jesus as the Messiah into the modern Western world, then we ultimately have to come to the libertarian conclusion. I don't think that there's any way that we can have a political allegiance to somebody other than Jesus. That's the conclusion that I drew.
Excellent. All right, what's next for your show? When you're done with the next quest, what's beyond next? What's next after next? Sorry.
So I recorded over the break. I got an extended break thanks to a lot of snow that we got, and so I recorded a bunch of solo episodes. So I had a series that I started in the first year of my podcast that was called Ludwig von Mises versus a Christian Scholar. And it was where I took the work of some Christian scholar who talked about capitalism in a negative way and then compared it to the work of Ludwig von Mises and demonstrated that they didn't actually understand capitalism. And that if you read Mises, what they're complaining about is actually socialism. And I did 2 episodes of that and had fully intended to do more. And I never got around to it. So I finally was able to record one on N.T. Wright, and I got some other ones in the works. So I got some solo episodes coming up, and I'm going to do a couple of other episodes on biblical passages about economics and politics, and just try to frame those in their historical context and work through the significance of those passages towards us. And then after that, I do have a lot of books coming up on biblical studies and theology. Many of them have to do with like resurrection and kingship. So I will be kind of, I guess, moving back in that a direction that might feel a little bit more comfortable for my listeners who are like, why is he talking to all these people about the methods and historical Jesus research? What does that have to do with why I'm listening to the show?
Yeah. Well, I've had Kelly Wiener-Smith on to talk about colonizing Mars, and I mean, it was literally like you said, in some sense, a vanity project. And it's like, you could do this from time to time. It's your show, so that's
right.
good.
That's the beauty about having a podcast is I can do whatever I want. And I guess the one other thing I want to say about that too is that one of the goals that I had from the outset of this podcast was that I wanted to help Christians be exposed to libertarian ideas, because I think that libertarianism is completely compatible with our faith. But I also wanted to interject libertarianism into the conversation regarding biblical scholarship. And I've been fortunate enough to meet a lot of biblical scholars who are kind of like closet libertarians. And actually I have a pretty funny story I can talk to you about off air. I don't want to out anybody in public here. But there are a lot of people out there that are thinking these ideas. And it's been great to have all of these scholars come on my show that aren't Protestant or sometimes even Christian, and there aren't libertarians, and just be given a fair hearing by someone that has a different political perspective than them for an hour. I think that is an incredible way to reach out to people that would never otherwise take our ideas seriously.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I applaud what you're doing on your show. I love listening to your episodes, and you're a great interviewer. You also clearly are a teacher who knows how to tell people what you need to communicate to them and help them think through different things. So I really appreciate it. I'm glad you're part of the Christian Liberty Network. And thanks for coming on this episode, man.
Hey, I appreciate it, Doug. Thank you.